Okay, I wasn't really expecting another commentary in a short time. Personally, I wanted to focus more on gaming-related content again, but I guess you could technically count this as one? Kind of. Someone named Max Quaza decided to make a video talking about what retro game console people deem to be overrated, to which she brings up the Nintendo GameCube. The thumbnail in itself just screams Material Vibe, so of course I had to jump in on it. Now, as someone who loves the Nintendo GameCube, I will try to give this video the benefit of the doubt. I won't try to be harsh on him since it is his own opinion, but that still doesn't mean I can't call out some of the problems I have with his reasons. That being said, let's get the shit started.
The first one is a retro console that has gotten a lot of attention in the past 5 years, and that is the GameCube. Now, originally when it released, it was definitely underrated, especially when it came to the sales, but as of lately, the console has received a lot of praise, and it definitely deserves some of that, but I can't help but feel that a lot of it is purely driven by nostalgia. People tend to forget that the GameCube released in the same time period as the PS2 and Xbox original, and although the Xbox was extremely powerful, it definitely didn't speak to the younger audiences as much as Nintendo, but the PS2 on the other hand spoke to everyone. Most of the games you can find on the GameCube can also be found on the PS2, and while yes, the GameCube has a lot of great console exclusives, so does the PS2, and as a matter of fact, the PS2 has just under 3 times the amount of games in its library compared to the GameCube. So then why do people opt for the GameCube nowadays when it has a smaller library? Well, mainly because of the notable games on the system such as Smash Bros. Melee, F-Zero, and Metroid Prime. These are all really good games, but that being said, those are only a few releases amongst its 600 plus library of games, which makes you think, are the other hundreds of games worth checking out? And well, sorta. And the reason I'm saying this is because although the GameCube has some great games like Resident Evil 4, Beautiful Joe, and Tony Hawk Pro Skater, so does the PS2, and actually the PS2 has most of the same games as the GameCube. And this is why I tend to think the GameCube is kinda overrated, because you can grab the same game on the PS2 for a fraction of the cost.
While it is true that you could simply buy the same game for the GameCube on the PS2 as well, I don't really see how that makes it overrated. It just means that if you own that console, you could just buy it for that console you own. Whether it's the PS2, GameCube, or hell, even the Xbox, which you don't bring up for some reason. Not only that, but sometimes the GameCube versions of those games can be better than the PS2 counterpart. One game you brought up would be Resident Evil 4. Now sure, the PS2 version sold more copies since it was available on a much more popular system, alongside with it including 2 additional content, but some people still prefer the GameCube version because of how powerful the game was on the console. Another Capcom example would be Killer 7. While the game was originally planned to be a GameCube exclusive title before being a multi-platform title for the PS2, most people still prefer the GameCube version since the game was made specifically for that console. The load times were faster and there's less slowdowns than the PS2 version, which was received less than the GameCube counterpart. And lastly, you said that it could be because of nostalgia? Well, yeah, you're right, but if anything, that doesn't make it overrated. People truly had nostalgia for the console and how much Nintendo put in care for it. Its first-party titles pretty much gave it away since those were the main moneymakers. Smash Bros. Melee, Super Mario Sunshine, Metroid Prime 1 and 2, Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, Animal Crossing becoming popular when it was released in America for GameCube only, Pikmin was a brand new IP made specifically for the console, and many more. It proved its legacy during the 6th generation, so I don't see how nostalgia makes the console overrated.
On top of that, the hardware for a PS2 is much cheaper, and you can find memory cards for $2 to $3 locally. So it seems that while the GameCube wasn't a success during its release, nowadays people have come to appreciate its solid first-party lineup of games. But its lack of third-party support and insanely high pricing nowadays makes me feel the GameCube has become a little overrated and not worthwhile for new buyers, especially when considering how cheap Xbox and PS2 games are at the moment. You'd be hard-pressed to find any good GameCube title for $5 to $10 as of 2023.
The high prices for GameCube games can mostly depend on the condition and the quality of the game itself, both in terms of whether the game is good or the condition of the game itself it's in. Once again, Resident Evil 4. While yes, the GameCube version of the game might be a bit more expensive than the PS2 counterpart, you also have to understand that it's hard trying to find a copy of RE4 for the GameCube nowadays since compared to the PS2 version. The GameCube version has less content, sure, but again, it's the most powerful version of the game, since it was made specifically for that console alone. The PS2 version is just a port that came out a few months months later, just with slightly weaker graphics. And plus, retro games themselves are hella expensive no matter what version of the game you buy. Whether you go to a local retro game store near you or order one on eBay, consoles and games are going to be expensive. And as I say that, I am slowly turning my hair gray. Jesus Christ, I'm getting old. Someone stop me, please. Even if the games aren't in their near perfect conditions, complete with a disc and manual, you're still going to pay a hefty amount of cash for some of the rarer games that come out. As someone who just bought Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes at a local game convention in Syracuse for about $110, I know firsthand. Unfortunately, it just depends on whether or not you're really into collecting retro games to spend that much money on it. Lastly, PS2 games are much easier to find nowadays and cost less because of the lineup of games. The PS2 has over 3,000 games, as you mentioned, which opens up the opportunity to sell a lot of games for low prices. Meanwhile, the GameCube has less games under its belt. It only has 600 plus games in total, and unless if you grew up with a console like me back in the day, trying to find games for the console nowadays will be rough. Hell, even I am still having issues trying to find some games for the console, as mentioned before with MGS: The Twin Snakes, that cost $110. The PS2 was the most accessible console during the 6th generation since everyone used to own a PS2 and many third-party titles. And since the PS2 isn't as powerful as the GameCube, of course, it's going to be the cheapest version to find. Now, I know it sounds like I think that the PS2 is overrated, and I can understand why some people would think that, but that's not really the case. I think the PS2 is a really good console, but these points don't really make the GameCube overrated either. In fact, I feel like it's the exact opposite. It makes it underrated, and that's why many people still deem the console as underrated because of that. It shoots this video straight in the foot, in my opinion. Anyways, I'm done with this commentary. The rest of the video is him talking about why the SNES isn't overrated, which is actually a valid reason. Final thoughts? Don't do drugs. There we go. That's the final thoughts. Just roll the credits.